Good afternoon, and to some of you, good evening. My name is Peter Mayers. On behalf of the Strategy, Performance, and Accountability team here at Tetra Tech, we are really delighted to be hosting this Glocal Evaluation session on From Data to Decision, Practical Applications of AI in Global Programs. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who don't know us, Tetra Tech supports U.S. government partners, multilateral donors, foundations, and private sector clients across a wide overseas portfolio, including in many difficult emergency and conflict-affected settings. In this work, we are always looking for better ways to strengthen evidence use and improve decision-making. While we are benefiting from the tremendous efficiencies offered by AI, we firmly believe it is human expertise that gives AI context, credibility, and practical value, especially in the places where we work. Put more simply, AI, in our view, is only as useful as the human judgment behind it. Our goal for today's session is to share where our experts believe AI holds real promise, as well as highlight practical guardrails that we think are needed to use it well. We'll start with a broader discussion of how AI is being integrated into our evaluation workflows, with a focus on finding the right balance between efficiency and human. From there, we'll move into a series of short practitioner presentations on specific use cases. Now, while we are really looking forward to sharing our experience, we are genuinely eager to hear from you and from colleagues joining us from around the world who are bringing your own insights. And so at the start of each presentation here, you will see a discussion question. Please share your perspectives in response to these questions so that we can continue to learn and improve our own practice. And we will almost certainly be using AI to analyze and code the responses. For those of you who want to continue and go through all four presentations, which we'll be leading today, there will be an open Q&A at the end. That will be in about 40 to 45 minutes. Please feel free to post your questions in the discussion bar whenever they occur to you. But we'll try to wrap this broader discussion and Q&A by 2:30 East Coast time. With that, let me introduce our panel of experts for today. Tim Shiflett leads Tetra Tech's digital solutions work, including the platforms that support data collection, storage, analysis, and reporting. He'll talk about where AI can really add value in evaluation and where human judgment still needs to be front and center. Rahel Giro brings over 15 years of experience leading mixed method assessments and evaluations in resilience, food security, social protection, and humanitarian action. She will speak on how AI can strengthen predictive analytics while also underscoring the limits of these tools when data quality is weaker and when human validation is necessary. Ali Hayat has more than 20 years of experience managing complex M&E systems and third-party monitoring in development and humanitarian settings. He will explore the underuse of visual data in evaluations and how advances in AI and image recognition can improve data collection, analysis, and insight generation. And finally, Adam Weber brings over 10 years of experience working on analytical and data-driven initiatives in the education sector. He will present a real-world case study on tool selection for measuring learning outcomes, and will be inviting the audience to consider the trade-offs between transparency, flexibility, and user experience. A final point of housekeeping. At the request of the Global Evaluation Initiative organizers, please share your information using the survey form, which is in the sidebar here. And without further delay, let me turn it over to my colleague, Tim. Over to you, Tim.
Hey, thanks, Peter, for that great introduction. As Peter said, my name's Tim Shiflett. I lead technology here at Tetra Tech. Now, it's kind of odd to admit this at a conference about evaluations and evaluators, but I myself am not an evaluator. But of course, Tetra Tech has completed thousands of evaluations. And in my role, I underpin a lot of the technology that evaluation teams use. And of course, AI has been the hot topic over the past 2 to 3 years. So here I am. Now, to set this tone from the conversation, I am not anti-AI. It's not an anti-AI conversation. AI is here to stay. Nor will this be of the tone that AI will replace everybody, replace all evaluators. As I said, the session is going to focus on finding the right balance between the two and highlight the important role of expert evaluators in every evaluation, even if we are using AI. So first, just by quick show of hands, I'd like to know how many people in the audience have already used AI in some part of an evaluation workflow. If you have, just raise your hand real quick so I get a good sense of where the audience is. All right, it's coming in pretty quick. Right, it looks like maybe at least a third or half of the audience has used AI in some capacity. And that makes a lot of sense because in many ways, AI is already on the evaluation team. And that's because evaluators are under increasing pressures across all fronts. So here at Tetra Tech, we see increased demand for rapid evaluations so that evidence and recommendation can inform decision-making more quickly. That increases the pace of every step in the evaluation process. And in addition, we see more data volumes, those lit reviews are getting larger, limited budgets, and those budgets can sometimes lead to staffing constraints. And AI promises to address most or all of these challenges directly. So lower level tasks can be automated or simplified. AI can be used for large scale document review and faster data synthesis. It can even draft sections of reports or code qualitative data. And really what you see on the screen here is just the tip of the iceberg. We could talk for the next hour or even more about all the benefits AI promises, from greater analytical capabilities to fact checking, things like this. But the main takeaway is that AI does directly address a lot of the pressures that evaluation teams are using, evaluation teams face, and that's why they're using AI. And even if you aren't using AI right now or can't use it for every step of your evaluation process, the use cases are expanding rapidly. So these are, at least my kind of view of the different steps and evaluations. You may have your own steps, but you can imagine how AI can be used for every step of this in this process, from a literature review, for synthesizing a lot of documents, to transcribing and translating key informant interviews, to drafting reports, the validation, dissemination of the report. And even if you can't use AI for a step today, the space is expanding so rapidly that if you were to come back in a month or 3 months or 6 months and try again, there's a good chance you could apply AI to that step. And one way to view about how AI is used in evaluations is to think about it on this spectrum. Where on the left, you have a traditional evaluation. This is human-led, manual synthesis, traditional coding, all the things that we were doing 5 or 10 years ago. And on the right, you have a fully AI-led evaluation, where it's generating the content, doing the lit review, maybe extracting key insights, or even conducting key informant interviews itself with minimal human oversight. And every evaluation team and every organization conducting evaluations have to make a decision on where you want to exist on this spectrum. But as you move from left to right on the spectrum, there are some trade-offs. Now, what I'm about to say isn't perfect, and we got some pushback internally here when we were talking about this concept, but I chose to keep it because I think the disagreement or that discussion kind of highlights the issues we're all dealing with when we choose to integrate AI into our evaluation. As you move from left to right, you get greater efficiency, right? So reduced cost, maybe faster evaluation, faster analysis, but you also get lower explainability, right? AI can sometimes be a black box. You don't exactly know what it's doing, and it's harder to defend those positions. As you move to the right, you get greater analytical insight. AI can look at problems in different ways. It can find patterns and themes in large data sets that humans cannot, but you also create more governance risk, right? What's happening to the data, privacy, confidentiality, security. There's more oversight there that has to be done from a governance perspective. And all this leads to a question, which is, how do we maximize speed and insight, take advantage of those benefits from AI while maintaining strong governance and explainability? So we want to maximize those benefits or gains because they're very real, right? So I view this as 2 buckets of gains. You have those operational gains and speed and scale, and analytical gains like pattern detection, rapid summarization, all the things we discussed. We need to maintain these and deal with a lot of those risks. We already talked about lack of explainability, and the next 2, hallucination and fabricated citations and things like bias, those are well known already with AI. But the one that we're currently trying to grapple with right now here at Tetra Tech is trust. So that's the trust that we have with our clients, or rather our clients have with us, with our stakeholders, and with our beneficiaries. To build that trust, we must be able to explain and defend how our conclusions are reached, and that becomes very difficult with opaque or poorly governed AI workflows. And we also must protect the confidentiality and security of the data that we collect, again, to protect our clients and our beneficiaries. So how is the data handled? Will it be used for training? Can it be exposed to folks outside the evaluation team, either intentionally or unintentionally? As an organization, we've done thousands of evaluations. And we've done them in very sensitive places like Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, Venezuela, and most recently Ukraine. And also the topics of our evaluations are often very sensitive themselves. So when we work in locations and on topics where confidentiality and security is paramount and at the top of mind of every person we interact with, we must have great security and confidentiality. And we know if our colleagues and stakeholders don't trust the AI we use, they don't trust us. And lastly, AI can't capture the institutional knowledge and expertise that individual evaluators and organizations bring to the table. So here at Tetra Tech, we have all this, decades of expert evaluations with decades of experience. That expertise, despite OpenAI's best efforts, cannot be extracted and incorporated into an AI tool. We must unlock that expertise and enable it to be more effective rather than replace it with a generic tool. All right, so what does an evaluator or an evaluation team do? Well, what we're doing here on our team is we're focusing on human-in-the-loop evaluation, where AI supports evaluators at tasks where it can be used for safely with human oversight. But humans lead the way on tasks where judgment, context, validation, and accountability really matter. And it's not a binary argument. On the left, these are tasks where we think AI can be used for, summarization, coding, but it's not that it's doing all the work. A human is still really engaged in these activities. And on the right, despite humans taking the overwhelming lead in the work, they might be using some AI tools along the way, but kind of put it in these two different buckets. And in all cases, AI complements human evaluators. It does not replace them or their responsibility. So this is how it might look like on those evaluation steps that we showed earlier, where items in green here are where we think there's a lot of value to using AI, relatively low risk with a lot of gain in terms of efficiency, speed, and cost. The areas here in yellow, we're approaching more cautiously, right? We see some value. We're exploring these areas, but we're not quite sold yet. A good example is data collection. We know that some folks are experimenting with using AI-led key informant interviews, and that makes a lot of sense from a cost and efficiency perspective. But what are you losing if you're taking that approach? For example, is the key informant interview going to be totally forthcoming in an AI evaluation versus if they're conducting that interview with an expert evaluator, in person or virtual? And then, of course, on the bottom right, we have validation. That step, we are pretty strong. It has to have a 100% human role. Take that stance pretty hard when it comes to validating findings and conclusions. All right, so then how are we operationalizing this, right? So we have these kind of 5 key buckets that we're working on. The first is we're talking openly amongst our evaluation teams about what is and is not an acceptable use of AI specific to that particular evaluation. And then we're also determining on each evaluation the level of human review requirements, right? When it comes to a literature review or summarization or translation or transcription, what does a human have to do to protect ourselves and our clients and the data? We're also documenting standards on how to cite when AI is used, right? So developing that documentation, make sure we're being very transparent about its use. We're working with IT, that's me internally, to ensure we comply with data and cybersecurity policies, both our own and our clients. And we're being open about the limitations of AI, right? Internally as a team and also with our clients. All right, so that hopefully sets the stage for the rest of the discussion. I would like to leave you though with one question to think about, and if you can drop your answer, your thoughts in the chat, we can maybe return to it later on in the conversation. But the question is, where do you draw the line with AI? And specifically, which evaluation task, whether the ones on the screen or ones that you use yourself, would you never delegate to AI? And what do you already trust it to perform? And with that, Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. And again, we really value and are interested in what the group of practitioners who have joined us today, whether you're a professional practitioner, whether you're a student, whether you're somewhere else in the broader spectrum of monitoring, evaluation, and learning, really interested to hear how you are using AI and what, in an evaluative sense, where you draw the line. So please, if you haven't answered, we have the question prompt there in the sidebar. Which evaluation task would you never delegate to AI, and which do you already trust it to perform? Really interested in your answer. With that, we'll be shifting gears now to our second presenter, over to Rahel. Over to you, Rahel.
Thank you, Peter. Hi, everyone. I'm Rahel Diro. I'm a program director at Tetra Tech. So over the years, my work has focused on linking humanitarian systems with financial instruments to enable faster and more efficient response Today I'll present about AI and machine learning and risk analytics and early warning systems. So in my presentation, I will try to make the case that there are significant improvements that are possible in humanitarian response by leveraging AI while preserving the human element. So most of the existing humanitarian systems are reactive, meaning they respond only after the impacts become visible. Again, this is in the context of places where there are scarce resources. There is one study that shows about 50% of humanitarian crises are predictable, but only 1% of funding is pre-arranged. And a major limitation is the reliance on lagging indicators. So these are data that reflect conditions after they have already deteriorated. Think of, for instance, malnutrition in children under 5. And by the time these indicators signal a problem, it's already too late to prevent harm. And this highlights a critical gap in the current system, which is the underutilization of early signals that could trigger preventive measures. So AI and machine learning can enable the systems to shift from descriptive monitoring to predictive analysis. These technologies analyze historical and real-time data to identify patterns and correlations. A simple example is machine learning models linking rainfall anomalies with crop failure or food insecurity outcomes. Of course, this is not new. We have been doing this even before AI or machine learning models came into play, but now we can do it at a much more granular level. Partly because AI also enables us to process large volumes of diverse data, including satellite imagery, weather and climate data, market trends, much more efficiently than traditional methods. So just to give you a real-world example, I want to share this seasonal calendar for the agricultural season in Malawi. The timeline highlights how the food crisis evolves across the agricultural cycle. And the goal of predictive analytics is to intervene long before it's too late. So at the earliest stage, we rely on seasonal climate forecasts, rainfall forecast. For instance, right now there is a super El Nino forecast, so it's possible to take action based on that forecast. As the season progresses, we start getting rainfall data, actual rainfall data, vegetation indexes or crop conditions using crop models. And as we get to the end of the harvest season, then risks begin to materialize. So we start seeing what we call trailing indicators, so early signs of stress in households. This includes reduced food consumption, for instance, poor harvests, rising prices, increased malnutrition. At this point, we're really confirming the impacts, signaling the need for immediate action. And if response action is further delayed, then these indicators start to get worse. We'll start seeing extreme food insecurity, malnutrition, asset depletion, in some cases, migration. And so at this stage, we can't really predict. We're just documenting outcomes. And the idea, again, is to emphasize that predictive analysis is the idea of responding when we start seeing the leading indicators as opposed to the trailing indicators. And the other element that predictive analytics enables us is to develop trigger-based systems. These systems use predefined thresholds to link to specific indicators to determine when a response should be activated. For example, taking action if rainfall levels fall below a certain threshold during a critical period. This obviously enables an objective and timely response. But more importantly, the systems can be integrated with financial instruments such as contingency funds or insurance instruments, which makes resources more readily available as soon as the trigger is activated, which results to an early response. That's all and good, but despite disadvantages, AI-driven systems also face several challenges and limitations. A big one being data availability and quality. This is a significant constraint, particularly in places that we work in, conflict-affected regions, places where there is very limited monitoring infrastructure. To give you an example, the map on the left shows weather stations that are reporting to the World Meteorological Organizations globally. And as you can see, there are few of them, for instance, in Africa, as compared to Europe or North America or India, for instance. Of course, nowadays there are, for instance, daily rainfall data at 4-kilometer resolution, but that's still an estimate based on physics. It's not the actual rain that falls on the ground. So there needs to be some level of ground truthing and validation to ensure data accuracy. And another important point is AI and this index trigger systems rely on generalized data, but decisions are localized. For instance, farmers' outcomes vary by local practices. Even at an individual level, the type of crops or soil management practices or the time when the farmer decides to plant really determine the outcomes. So even if the environmental impact is the same or the hazard is the same, the end outcome varies by this individual decision. So ignoring these realities and over-reliance on just AI increases mismatches. For instance, there could be a crop failure, but the insurance mechanism may not trigger a payout. And the main way to address this challenge is to combine AI tools with strong validation processes and human oversight. So to conclude, AI obviously enables humanitarian systems to identify emerging threats and act early and trigger timely action. And also what's a real game changer in terms of efficient, timely response is linking this systems to financing or financial mechanisms that will make resources more readily available, which means more faster and effective support for vulnerable populations. But as I tried to make the case in the previous slide, the technology alone is not enough. The models are as good as the data behind them, and they can miss complex realities. So the human expertise remains really important to validate the insights and to reach the technology and the local context. So I argue that in the end, the strongest systems combine both the speed of AI and scale with human judgment, which would enable both of them to be more reliable and adaptable. So with that, I will also like to leave you with a question, which Peter has shared in the chat as well. Considering, the challenges and the need for ground truthing and validation on the ground, what partnerships are needed to scale predictive systems? So thank you so much. Back to you, Peter.
And thank you, Rahel. And again, the opportunities are clearly evident with predictive analytics to make resource scarce funding for humanitarian and sort of crises more effective. And thank you for bringing that to our attention, as well as the necessity of maintaining that oversight and that judgment, especially in some of these difficult places where we do our work. So please do join the conversation if you have a view on the types of partnerships that are needed to both scale predictive analytics so it is more effective and efficient, as well as maintain that oversight control. Please do share. With that, I'll now be handing over to our next presenter, Ali Hayat.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. A pleasure to be here with you. I'm Ali Hayat, Senior Program Director. I lead our Strategy, Performance, and Accountability Solution Group. Over the next 8 to 10 minutes, I'll try to convince you to use more visual data when you conduct evaluations, but to do so responsibly and in a way that's systematic. So let me just start by laying out my sort of key elements of the argument that I'll share today. To begin with, I think, based on my experience, visual data is underutilized across evaluations. There's greater reliance on other types of data collection, including interviews, document reviews. And when I talk about visual data, I'm talking about data that you can obtain through cameras, through drone footage, satellite imagery, and even community sort of participatory methods. One of the other points that I sort of argue is that the advances in AI-powered tools, image recognition software, provide very cost-effective approaches and means to start interpreting visual data and integrating it into our evaluations. Despite these advantages, I think it is very critical, similar to the points that some of my colleagues have raised, it is critical to think of the best practices, which borrow from good evaluation standards, some of the best practices in third-party monitoring, to be able to take full advantage of these new technologies. So starting with my first point, this greater emphasis on secondary data through document reviews or interviews and surveys, but not so much visual evidence. The thing that I find intriguing about this is that most of the decisions we as humans make require some element of visual validation. But in a lot of these evaluations, we're relying a lot more on what was said or what's documented. I think visual data also becomes really important in remote settings or conflict-affected settings where the donors, but also the implementers, may have very limited insight into how these projects manifest themselves, what kind of impact that they have. Some of the other limitations of standard methods could be that you have social desirability bias, people saying things that they think that you're expecting to hear, biases related to the implementer being more subjective to how they've performed in a specific project. And I'll illustrate how using visual data can address some of these potential limitations. So this is based on an actual evaluation we did a couple of years ago, where we did have a significant component focused on interviews, surveys, qualitative discussions, and document reviews. And so one of the key outcomes of interest in this evaluation was sustainability of the infrastructure that was built in communities. And one of the key assumptions was that the community leaders and the community members will come together to both maintain the equipment and the infrastructure and generate revenue to be able to do so in the longer term. Looking at findings from our interviews, looking at the data from the documents, we have this picture that the facilities had been maintained, that they had generated enough resources to do so. We integrated some elements of third-party monitoring in this evaluation. So we randomly selected different set of sites and sent our teams to observe, visually observe some of these sites. And so some of the evidence, the visual data sort of made our findings much more nuanced, because we found that what we had seen from the other data was true in certain places, but we also found places where the equipment was not being used, the infrastructure had been damaged, there had been environmental and social impact on the surrounding communities, but it had not come out very clearly in the documents we had reviewed or the interviews we had conducted. So now I'll move to a few very sort of simple cases or use cases, and focus a little bit on infrastructure projects to highlight ways in which visual data can be very useful. So anytime you're trying to evaluate a project, you're looking at outcomes and you're trying to assess if those outcomes have been achieved or how the project has contributed to those outcomes. So if you're looking at an infrastructure project where some of the key outputs are associated with growth in market activity, economic development, those types of outcomes are easier to visualize. And that's an important distinction, right? Visual data can be useful for some outcomes, but not others. And the ability of AI and image recognition softwares allows us to, detect, classify, and count things that in the past would have taken a lot more time and resources to do so. Now, this image and the image that I will share, or the next slide, these are static images, but your leveraging of visual data doesn't have to be static. So you can use some of these tools to go along a corridor, and that provides a very cost-efficient way to look at both compliance monitoring aspects of an infrastructure project, but also its impact on its surrounding communities. And if you do this systematically, you can start to measure change over time and in very granular ways. One of the other things I would say is that this example is focused very much on the ground, and some of this data could be obtained through handheld cameras. And one of the things we have applied even in conflict setting is 360 cameras, which provide you a more dynamic view of the surroundings that you're examining. But this doesn't have to be sort of the limit. You can also use geospatial data. And so again, on the theme of economic activity measurement or its impact, here you see a few examples of how looking at nighttime light data, which is publicly available, and we have leveraged it in some previous evaluations where we looked at the long-term impact within Afghanistan of certain projects and the extent to which it affected the intensity and the density of nighttime lights, because they serve as good proxies for population density, but also growth in economic activity. So this is a much higher level aggregation of visual data, but also very useful for projects that are large scale. Similarly, for environmental and social impact assessments, there are a lot of different ways in which you can use different types of visual data, whether it's obtained through drone footage, handheld cameras, 360 cameras, or geospatial data. So again, this is a very simple example of observing change over time in specific location. You could also use visual data to understand impact on livelihoods, specific projects, whether these are positive impacts or negative impacts, effects in terms of pollution, and changes in land use as a result of a project or an infrastructure activity. To conclude, and this is something that I mentioned up front as well, is all the promise that AI and image recognition software brings is not enough on its own. What is required are a number of different practices that we are familiar with and have applied and tested, both in the monitoring space, but also in the evaluation space. So thinking about your baseline is very critical, and that includes vantage points of how you collect or where you collect the visual data. It includes the timing. So seasonality is important. If you're observing a market, what time of the day, what time of the year you go to that market is important. And thinking about all of this in advance to the extent possible is critical. So if there is a way to embed some of these ideas of how you would trace progress over time in ongoing monitoring, then that data becomes available for an evaluation team, whether it's at the midpoint stage or at the endline stage. It's also important to think, and this is something we do in good evaluation practice, linking project level outcomes and results to the project activities, which will help you, distinguish between the project effects or impacts versus some of the externalities, whether they're positive externalities or negative externalities. These are unintended outcomes resulting from the intervention. And the last point, which I think is the most important point from a human, subject protection perspective and research ethics perspective is that when you're doing this type of sort of visual data collection, the importance of training your teams, whether these are teams of experts, whether these are teams of regular data collectors, or even like experts like engineers, training them on the do's and don'ts of what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, identifying use cases where there is little or no risk to the population, that where you're operating is critical. And to conclude, I'll just sort of repeat the question that Peter has also posted is, as I said, I'm intrigued by the fact that there is this underutilization of visual data. I'd like to hear from you on if you have used this data in your evaluations and how, and if not, why not? Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, for that interesting presentation. And I think it gives us all, in a moment where we're increasingly being asked to tell compelling stories. Yes, visual evidence is not just part of storytelling, it's about providing an additional point of triangulation here. So do you agree with Ali's point? Is visual evidence, visual data underutilized? And if you aren't using it, why aren't you using it? We proceed now to our final presentation, last but not least, over to Adam Weber.
Thank you, Peter, and hi, everyone. My name is Adam Weber. I am a program manager with Tetra Tech. My own background is in education. I'm a former high school math teacher. And for this presentation, I'm really interested in exploring a challenge that we often face in our sector, which is how can we make expertise more accessible? We often work in environments that are constrained and that are data poor. And there are real barriers to accessing expertise. It could be a language barrier, it could be an institutional barrier. And so what I would like to explore is what are some solutions using AI to lower those barriers and to close that gap and see what the different options are, because I think there is more than one path, and I'm really interested in exploring that with you today. I'm going to focus on a particular use case in education, which is choosing the right student assessment tool. So when you're doing evaluations in education, you're often very interested in student learning outcomes. And a challenge is to choose the right tool to measure those outcomes. There are a lot of factors you need to consider when you're choosing the right tool. You need to consider, for example, the grade level of the students you will be assessing, how you will use the data. What is your population of interest? Are you interested in students nationwide? Are you interested in a particular subgroup? What are you going to do about benchmarks? Are you interested in, comparing the performance of students against some sort of standard? These are, and many other factors, are really questions that you have to answer. And your answers to those questions will lead you to different tools. And there's a lot of options out there, as you can see on the slide. So several months ago, we actually tried to grapple with this challenge with a client. The challenge was, how can we make it easier for evaluators to identify the right student assessment tool for them? And our solution was an interactive decision tree. This is not an AI tool. This is something that we developed using Miro board, which is a virtual whiteboard. And it basically walks the user through a series of questions. And based on their answers to those questions, it will point them to a particular tool. It will recommend a particular student assessment tool for them. This was a relatively low-cost solution to develop. It did require quite a bit of upfront effort to kind of map out the decision tree and the decision points and mapping them to particular tools. But overall, it was a pretty low cost and easy solution to develop. Unfortunately, as we were developing this tool, we realized it wasn't really user-friendly. It's a little bit overwhelming. As you can see on this slide, this shows you just part of the decision tree. And as the user, you wouldn't see all of the steps at the same time. But even if we narrow in on a particular step here, and I know this is too small to read, but basically at this point, it's asking you to decide how you are going to use the data, and then it's giving you some options. And then based on that, you need to decide your population of interest and benchmarks, et cetera. And as someone who is maybe not an expert, I might be overwhelmed by this. I might be a little bit flustered. There's a lot of repetition. I might not know the right answer, or I might have an answer that I don't see as one of the options. And this could leave me pretty perplexed. So we started to think about what are some AI tools that we can use to make this more user-friendly. And of course, one option is to use LLM. So these chatbots that we all know and love, ChatGPT being one example of them. These are really great at kind of natural and open-ended conversations. It's really easy for you to ask it, whatever you want, and it will generate, some responses based on patterns. So they're very accessible, but of course, they also can hallucinate, as we know. They are generative, so they can, generate different answers, different recommendations, different times that you use it. And they're also a black box. You're not quite sure its thought process and why it's leading you towards a particular recommendation. So on the one hand, it does, if you maybe don't have access to that expertise, you're not an expert yourself, it can help you. But at the same time, not being an expert, you're not quite sure if the information that it's giving you is bad. So another option that we looked at is what's called the rule-based chatbot. So these are very common when you go to websites to, like, say, buy insurance, and you'll see a little chatbot come up and ask if you have any questions. So it's a very common customer service tool. And it is a chatbot, so it is very easy to interact with and have a conversation with, but it's been strictly coded within a certain set of parameters. So it's been strictly programmed to follow a certain logic. And if you try to request, outputs that fall outside of that logic, it will break essentially. So basically, if you try to ask it a question that it was not designed to answer, it's not going to be able to answer that question. So on the one hand, because it is, strictly programmed to follow along the decision tree logic, it would be more transparent, but it is less flexible and is more rigid, and it might not be able to give you the information that you want. So I am going to stop there because I would really like to know from you, based on your experience or your thoughts, which approach do you think would work for you if you are trying to tackle this similar challenge of making expertise more accessible? Would you stick with our original solution, the non-AI solution, which is very transparent but not very easy to use? Would you opt to try to create some sort of custom GPT, an LLM that gives you more flexibility but a higher risk of bad information? Would you try to go with the rule-based chatbot, which is easier to use but more rigid and might not give you the information that you need? I'd like to know your thoughts on this. I'd like to know if you have another solution. There are other AI solutions as well. There could be a combination of solutions as well. So I'd like to open it up and hear from folks what they think. And I'll stop there.
And thank you, Adam. Again, you don't have to be an education expert to try to answer that last question, because for many of us, we are not subject matter experts, and we do have to grapple with finding an appropriate solution to a problem. So if it were you, how would you be using these different, think about these different trade-offs and selecting the right tool? We're interested to hear about it. While you think about that, we've actually come through the end of our presentations, and in just a moment, we'll be opening it to question and answer. Would ask that if people, the panel is yours. I'll be here to try to direct traffic to the right person, but if you have a particular question that you want to put to one of our panel experts, again, whether that's Tim, Rahel, Ali, or Adam, please feel free to name that person. Otherwise, I'll get direct traffic the best that I can. But maybe while people are thinking about, Adam, your final discussion question around, practically speaking, what would they do? Maybe a question for you. And this first question is thinking about AI frankly, as an opportunity to level the playing field for practitioners, perhaps people who are on this call, in fact, who don't necessarily have the same access or language or institutional connections that many international consultants do. What do you think are, some of the possible opportunities for AI, and where do you posit that?
Yeah, so I think it's an opportunity that's too big to ignore. I think so. I'll just kind of share like what our original solution was, which we opted to stick with the decision tree, just because we wanted to make it very transparent. We did end up using an AI solution, but not one that is actually here. We actually decided to create. So when you use the decision tree and you ultimately arrive at an assessment tool, that's your recommendation. You might not really know that much about that tool. So we did create some guidance that has some more information about that particular tool. And we created, I might turn to Tim for help here, but a retrieval augmented generation AI tool, which is basically, and it's an LLM, but it's tied to a knowledge base. So we put all this guidance into a folder and we tied it to this chatbot. So it is more strictly tied to the guidance. It is easier to interact with. It's not going to help you through the decision tree, but once you have identified a particular tool, it will help you find more information about that tool. But like I said, this was many months ago. To be honest, I think at this point, I would explore just using ChatGPT. I think the promises of accessibility, and if you're not an expert, and from my own personal experience, it's helped me so much if I don't really know that much about the topic, just having a conversation with it. I might think about some guidelines for people who are interacting with it, as far as questioning the information that it gives you. But if I were to tackle this challenge right now, I think the accessibility that the LLMs give us is just it's too much of an opportunity to ignore. But there is that trade-off that it's not going to give you information that is correct. But that's kind of the trade-offs that I've been struggling with.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks very much for your response. We have a question from Lisa here in the sidebar, a question for the group. What are we hearing from clients about the use of AI on evaluations? Are they hesitant if we outsource some factors of the evaluations to AI? We have a few clients on this phone call, so I will not put them on the spot. That would be very bad manners indeed. But if we were to generalize, maybe I'll start with you, Ali. What are you hearing from some of our key clients on their appetite for AI usage and evaluation?
Thanks for that question. And I think, AI the work on that has happened for many years, but its sort of common use is more recent, a few years old. So this is an evolving area. And anytime we deal with a client or work with a client, we're mindful of the rules that are, important for them to follow. We have seen a greater openness to use of AI in a responsible way, in particular because of the efficiencies it can bring. The sort of it can narrow down clients need to make decisions in real time, and being able to sort of reduce the duration of an evaluation by using some of these efficiencies, I think is a critical step. It also allows us to work with different sized budgets, smaller budgets, and clients where in the past it would be not possible for us to provide designs and approaches that could be, fit certain budgets. So I think the efficiency, the speed has been welcome, but I am also mindful from the client side, but also from our own internal rules and research ethics that, we have to be mindful of doing this responsibly.
Thanks, Ali. And perhaps Rahel or others on the group, if you have a different view, and again, various members of the panel here work with different clients. So if there are other points or perspectives you'd be interested in hearing.
So the one addition I would have, a lot of the concerns I'm seeing are about the use of LLMs in particular. Some of the other aspects of AI, other components of it, like machine learning or natural language processing, those have been in use for quite some time, beyond the last 2 or 3 years. And those I think are more well accepted from multiple perspectives, from cybersecurity to data privacy and whatnot.
And I mean, for predictive analytics, it's actually encouraged because the models are improved, but clients want to see the improvement, the validation, the need to go to the field and understand the actual practices of farmers, for example. So they appreciate, the improvement, the technology and the models, but they still want it to be validated.
And do you feel that there's a connection or correlation between wanting more validation in areas where we work, which are more data poor, which are more...
Exactly. That's mostly where we work in these applications anyway. So definitely.
Another question from Natasha. In humanitarian settings, is AI-generated visual evidence a breakthrough or a new ethical risk we're not ready for? I think what was it, the UK article, UK newspaper, The Guardian, there were images of AI-generated poverty scenes that were being used for fundraising. Extremely controversial. I don't know, I think it's even controversial, it's wrong. But as we think of additional applications for AI and how we both tell a story, but also validate, try to triangulate some of our findings, is there an ethical element here that we're not ready for? Again, Ali, since it was your presentation, probably one first direct to you, and then open it up to others.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for the question. I also noticed that I think Anna in the chat had a similar sort of comment about surveillance aspects or the populations, vulnerable population. So it is a critical issue. Maybe I can respond to Anna's point, I think first, and then to Natasha's question. I think one of the ways to address that is by exploring even participatory approaches where you want community members to provide you the visual evidence of their experiences, whether it's with the assistance they've received or how they view the projects impacting their lives. Now, to Natasha's question, I think this is really, really very important. Now, in terms of the visual evidence we have collected in humanitarian settings, I mentioned earlier the use of 360 cameras. When we use those cameras, the intention is to create an experience for our client who can virtually visit a site and experience what the site looks like. When we actually do those visits, we work with the implementers, but also time them, at a time when a facility may be empty, so we can walk through the facility and create that experience for the client without, having any individuals kept, photographed. If there are cases where we are looking at a distribution site, we use, software to blur the faces and guide our teams to capture images in a way that, protects the people that we're sort of better at the site. Last point I would make, and perhaps Rahel has more ideas on this, but visual evidence and leveraging AI to process some of that visual evidence at the geospatial level is at a much higher level. And so I think as you think about use cases, think about areas where, like infrastructure is a good example, where you can do that work and not have to worry too much about like individuals, because you could look at the infrastructure and its physical impact. But even disaster mapping, the geospatial data can be very helpful. And with AI, you can actually get classifications, which, as Rahel pointed out, would be important to validate. So if there's been damage in an area and AI interprets it a certain way, it would be good to validate that through some in-person monitoring as well. So those are some ideas on how you would tackle this, but it is front and center. These are very vulnerable populations, and I think the first responsibility is to ensure that they're not exploited in any way.
Thanks, Ali. Any other panelists like to have a crack at that question, or has he nailed it? We have a question here from Danielle. Where does AI add real value in complex analytical work? And where does it risk creating more noise than insight? Again, probably best to direct that to our predictive analytics expert, Rahel.
Sure. Thank you for that question, Danielle. So, I mean, especially for the humanitarian crisis that emanates from natural disasters, for example, there is a lot of application. There is some work going on right now, for instance, to kind of extend the forecastable window for the agriculture season. It can be super useful also if you have good data to identify who is the most vulnerable from the population for targeting purposes. Where it gets tricky and there will be maybe more noise than use is when you have huge data gaps, whether it's socioeconomic data or even in climate data. I can give an example. For instance, if you look at the meteorological station data in Rwanda, there is a big gap for years after the conflict in the 90s. So that would be very hard for AI. So that would be noisy if you use that data in AI models. Another big one is in conflict situations. So humanitarian crisis that emanates from conflicts is very hard to predict because it's based on human decision, not the physical environment. So I would say that would be another area where it would be cautious in using AI applications.
Thank you, Rahel. And on this sort of theme of so much of this discussion is about sort of the limits of AI and where it can take us. But I think we also recognize that there are innovative ways we can use AI to generate evaluation insights that we might otherwise miss. And so I guess, Tim, sort of if I could put a question to you, the flip side of that, what are some of the applications you see in the evaluative space or otherwise where the way we are as evaluators sort of trained to think and the way we've been sort of the craft of evaluation, what are the things that we might miss? What's innovative in AI that we can use to really sort of stretch ourselves and what we think is good, credible, evaluative judgment?
It's a great question, Peter. And the space is moving so rapidly, and there's more things every day. It's hard to focus on one particular, tool or something like that. But I think as a general rule, people use LLMs or these new breed of AI tools as a content creation tool, right? You're gonna use it to summarize something and create content. You'll draft a report, and I think that's great. But maybe a more useful approach is to think of them as thinking tools. And so you could use them to challenge your own decisions, your own processes, and find gaps in what you're doing yourself. So, for example, you could use it to audit your own decisions. So, in an evaluation, am I missing something with this evaluation design? Right. Another way you could use that is organizing your own thoughts and memories. Right. So recall them later on. I think this is going a little bit different direction. Almost back to Rahel, the question posed at Rahel. AI is very good at synthesizing large data sets, finding patterns, looking for that needle in a haystack, right? Whereas I think, though, it does a worse job at identifying if that needle matters. And so that is where you want the human to come in and determine that. So I don't know if that exactly answers the question.
No, I think it really it resonates. It resonates with my own experience and thinking, using AI not just to, of course, help synthesize information, but to challenge myself. And I've used AI personally to presented my conclusions and asked it to, based on the parameters that I set, tell me why my conclusions are wrong. And so sort of using AI as a way to test ourselves and use our the quality of the argument, the quality of the analysis to sort of build up an evaluative judgment. But at the same time, critically still being there, the expert in the room, the human in the loop, to say, look here, I agree with that judgment, or no, I do not. And that's based on, of course, the factors that we've been talking about as a group today, where we work, the types of populations that we work with, and some of the gaps in data and information that would normally feed into an AI analysis. It's critical that we put those practitioner expertise and insight to good use.
Another, just to jump in, another tool that we're kind of using more recently are these AI agents. And these are a little bit different in that it depends less on kind of the prompt that you give it and more on the instructions that you give it for your task. So it's helpful kind of to look at Danielle's question from a different perspective. If you want to map out your analytical process and look at the steps in that process, and think about if there are steps that are repetitive, steps that take you a lot of time, and think about programming an agent to do those steps for you. So it's kind of looking at it a little bit differently than an LLM, but it could be another way to use these tools.
I see maybe a related question from Bashir here in the sidebar. Bashir asks, can it be said that artificial intelligence can divert a greater part of the evaluator's effort and capabilities from focusing on evaluation itself to focusing on tools that assist in evaluation? Bashir, I don't know if you're feeling like you want to come off mute here. If you do, if you want to elaborate on the question, please do. If I were to interpret that, I guess I'm trying to understand, are you talking about sort of the process of getting to an evaluative answer, or what's sort of behind the question? If you can elaborate, please. Bashir, it's all right if you can't join us. And, if I put it to the panel, then is AI, a distraction from the core work of actually speaking to people, looking and examining data and just sort of diverting our attention away from that sort of core process, or is it something different? Ali, I don't know if you have a response to that.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Bashir, for the question. So I think there is a lot of bad AI use also. So given the efficiencies we've described, I can imagine that a lot of evaluations or evaluation teams may be tempted to rely on these tools and forego some of the responsibilities that we have as evaluators or the key decisions where we need to, share or have our insights impact the design of an evaluation, for example. I think in some cases, so this goes back to Tim's earlier presentation of like, what are some right use cases versus areas where we should have more human sort of oversight. And I would add another variable, which is like the available data, right? If you're evaluating an activity where you have a lot of really established available data, whether it's primary data or secondary data, using some of these tools is helpful because they can help you synthesize that information, and maybe you can do that work very quickly and efficiently. But if you're working on an evaluation where the data is limited, then the use of AI can be very problematic because you would be learning from the limited data and drawing conclusions based on that. So I think areas where we try to capture what our client wants, what is the the link of the project to a specific activity, sort of specific like manifestation in terms of impact, key elements of design, the considerations around sensitivities and interpretation, which while AI can synthesize information and identify patterns, but interpretation requires some more granular understanding of context. So I think Bashir's point may be playing out. We're seeing a lot of people relying on these tools, but for us, the big concern is to always ensure that, where one of the key areas we apply the best practices, which are still somewhat conventional and what we have done in the past as well.
Well, thanks, Ali. And when you say conventional, I think one of the related themes that sort of underpin our discussions today, and even the whole purpose of this initiative, is to talk about trust. If I'm a client, I want to be able to trust in what is being presented to me, and that starts with who did you speak to, and what did you learn from the evidence that's available. And I think there may be the temptation or the risk as part of trying to drive efficiencies that we as a sector or as practitioners, we are being pushed to cut people out of these evaluative processes. But as you said, I think that's just fundamental to sort of coming to a reasoned, measured judgment of something, which is critically talking to the people that matter, and that as the bedrock for every conclusion and recommendation that we ultimately make. Are there other questions that people have that they would like to pose to our group here? Welcome them, and I should add that while this session will, there are many sessions going on today and of the previous days. Your opportunity to connect with some of our experts is not limited to this sort of hour and a half segment. I am, unbeknownst to them, I'm about to post all my colleagues' emails in the group chat. So if you would like to reach out to them directly and say, I agree, or you're dead wrong, please do. You'll notice my name is not inserted there, so you can direct your pointed questions where they belong. But again, we'll give it another moment or two to see if anyone else has a question they would like to ask our panel before we close.
Like there's a question. Do you mean that we run the risk of AI use becoming an end of itself instead of being a means to achieving the main goal? Actually, I really like that question because that's actually the question that I considered for my presentation, which is, do you need to use AI and when do you need to use AI or not? And I think it comes down to, for me, what I was trying to get at is it depends on the problem that you're trying to solve. I think originally our problem that we were trying to solve was to equip experts who probably already know about these assessment tools and just give them an easy job aids. And that's why we went for the infographic. If my, if the problem I was trying to solve was to give someone who was not an expert, who's kind of very new to the field, and help them kind of get up to speed, I might choose a different solution. And that solution would probably use AI. So I think it helps to take a step back and not think about, oh, let's use AI, but think more about like what your problem is and what you're trying to solve, and then see if AI is a possible solution to that or not. That's just my 2 cents.
I would like to join on that last point. Well, again, unless there are any other questions from the audience, let me, to close, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining the conversation today, and to GEI for giving us the space to meet such a diverse and interesting array of evaluation and development practitioners, academic students from around the world. We really appreciate you listening to us, and hopefully you've learned something. And I should say, looking at some of your responses to where we are going as a company and as a group of practitioners who are trying to hone our own best practices, you give us real food for thought. So with that, thank you again. Have a good afternoon or evening, wherever you are, and we'll be in touch again, we hope. Take care.
I guess.